The organization sponsoring this debate and responsible for making the arrangements that make our presence here possible are the Creation Science Association of Madison and the Lutheran Collegians, also of Madison, and it is in their name that I welcome you tonight. The statement to be debated is that the theory of evolution is superior to the theory of special creation as an explanation for the scientific evidence related to origins. Supporting the affirmative side of this statement, and thus favoring the theory of evolution, is Professor John T. Robinson of the University of Wisconsin Department of Zoology. Speaking for the negative side of this statement, and thus favoring the creationist position, is Dr. Duane T. Gish of the Institute for Creation Research of San Diego, California. I would like to outline briefly the format for the evening's festivities, which are as follows. Professor Robinson will speak first, presenting the case for evolution. He will speak for not more than 1 hour. At the end of his presentation, there will be a 5-minute break. This will give the audience, give you in the audience, an opportunity to write questions on the paper that has been provided for you, questions that may have been prompted by his presentation. After that 5-minute break, Dr. Gish will speak for no more than 1 hour, presenting his case for creationism. Following that presentation, there will be a 10-minute break in which, again, you can write questions, and allowing time for the ushers to collect those questions for later presentation to the speakers. When things commence again after that 10-minute break, Professor Robinson will have first rebuttal for 15 minutes. Dr. Gish will then have his 15 minutes in counter rebuttal. Professor Robinson will again have time for rebuttal, but this time 5 minutes, followed by Dr. Gish's second rebuttal of 5 minutes. Without any further break or pause, we will move to questions from the audience, each speaker taking a question for not more than 3 minutes and in alternate sequence, one speaker to the other. Before I introduce the first speaker, it seems appropriate that I give a brief historical background outlining the circumstances that give this debate contemporary relevance. Ever since the time of Galileo in the 17th century, there have been continuous efforts made to find some kind of accommodation between the ever-growing, ever-changing views of the natural world resulting from scientific investigations of nature and the preservation of traditional truths held by many to be most forcefully embodied in the Christian faith and scriptural authority. By the late 19th century, many historians saw these efforts not as attempts at accommodation, but as irreconcilable conflicts. They spoke at this time of the warfare between science and religion. Whether those historians exaggerated or not, debate and controversy between scientists and religionists has persisted. No scientific concept has generated as much and as persistent an opposition by Christian fundamentalists as a theory of evolution, which depicts the human race as having evolved by natural law, by accident, so to speak, from lower orders of organic life. This view, of course, is in direct conflict with a literal view of the biblical account of man being created by a special act of God. This opposition first surfaced in a public way during the 1920s, when legislation designed to forbid the teaching of evolution in the public schools was introduced into 37 of the 48 state legislatures, and many of these laws were actually enacted. The feelings that lay behind such legislation was succinctly put by William Jennings Bryan, 3 times presidential candidate and the chief spokesman for the fundamentalist position at the famous Scopes trial in Tennessee in 1925. And he said, "We cannot afford to have a system of education that destroys the religious faith of our children." Opposition to these laws forbidding the teaching of evolution in public schools was founded on the political view that religious positions should not determine public policy, the traditional American principle of the separation of church and state. In the actual outcome of the Scopes trial, the defendant was found guilty, of course, of teaching evolution, which a charge he had never denied. And the teaching of evolution generally thereafter was done softly, local conditions determining pretty much how vigorously it might be presented in the classroom. But legal action designed to test the constitutionality of these laws persisted, and eventually all of them were declared unconstitutional by the late 1960s. In the same decade, 1960s, biology textbooks began to discuss evolution more openly than had been previously the custom. And as a result, there were founded the Creation Research Society in California in 1963, a group very much concerned that their children were being taught in school evolutionary doctrine that undermined the religious convictions of their parents. The tactics of this group of genuinely troubled and seriously concerned people has completely changed from those of the 1920s, when the attempts were made to keep evolution out of the schools. Since 1963, the attempt has been made to ask that the doctrine of creation be given equal time in the classroom with the theory of evolution. The justification being that creationism can properly be viewed as a scientific theory just as good as the theory of evolution. This tactic has had some success in a number of states, and a biology textbook written by two members of the Creation Research Society has been given approval by a few state boards of education. But opposition to this tactic has also had some success. For in 1975, the U.S. Court of Appeals in Tennessee struck down as unconstitutional a law passed in that state which required textbooks to give equal time to the Darwinian and biblical explanations of man's origins. More recently, in the state of Indiana, a judge has ruled that the use of the textbook written by the two members of the Creation Research Society mentioned above violates state law, the Constitution of the state of Indiana, and the Constitution of the United States. He based his decision on a finding that the textbook seeks to promote a, quote, fundamentalist Christian doctrine in the public schools. Thus we find on one side those who may, with William Jennings Bryan, feel that we cannot afford to have a system of education that destroys the religious faith of our children. And on the other side, we see those who would keep religion out of the schools. For as one critic expressed it, we don't want religious views smuggled into the classroom disguised as science. The issue thus is clear and seems to hinge on the answer to the question, does creationism provide as good as scientific an explanation for the present order of things as does evolution? Behind this question for debate lie these very emotional and partisan issues just referred to. But I ask the audience as well as the speakers to devote their attention to the particular question announced. That question is the theory of evolution superior to the theory of special creation as an explanation for the scientific evidence related to origins? Our first speaker, taking the affirmative side in support of evolution, is Professor John T. Robinson. Professor Robinson was educated in the universities of his native South Africa, receiving a bachelor's, master's, and doctorate of science. His early work dealing with fossil remains of African hominids brought him considerable international reputation as a physical anthropologist. Before coming to the University of Wisconsin, he held academic positions in his native country and lectured in many universities in both Europe and America. Since coming to the University of Wisconsin in 1963, he has taught in both the anthropology and zoology departments, though in recent years has confined his academic activities to zoology, where he is now giving a well-known course in organic evolution. Dr. Robinson.
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Gish, ladies and gentlemen, and the dog if he's still around. At the outset, I wish to make a few points clear. The first may seem to be trivial, though this is not how it seems to me. And it is this: it is my firm opinion that every person has the clear right to believe whatever they choose. And no one should try to ridicule their beliefs, the beliefs of others, or attempt to coerce them into believing something they don't wish to believe, or attempt to prevent them from explaining what it is that they believe. I do not feel threatened by ideas that are different from my own, and nor do I have any missionary urge to convince other people to believe as I believe, because I do think that it is a personal matter what it is that one believes. But I am, of course, perfectly happy to explain what it is that I do believe and why. Now, the second point is crucial. It concerns clear perception of the viewpoint, the basic point of departure of creationists. Creationists of the Creation Research Society frequently make the point that they represent, and I quote from Dr. Gish, the scientific case for creation, devoid of all references to the Bible or Genesis, and state that all members of the Creation Research Society are scientists with advanced degrees. The letters of invitation that started this proceeding this evening emphasized that the arguments would be made from a scientific, not a religious viewpoint. So let us see then what their viewpoint is, and some quotations from their publications will guide us. The first is from Dr. Henry Morris, or the first are from Dr. Henry M. Morris, who is director of the Institute for Creation Research in San Diego, of which Dr. Gish is associate director, and these quotes are from the Impact Series number 5. It is more productive to take the Bible literally than to interpret the actual facts of science within its revelatory framework. If the Bible cannot be understood, it is useless as revelation. I take that to mean that unless it speaks for itself perfectly clearly and doesn't have to be interpreted, then it's not doing its job as revelation. The quote continues, if it contains scientific fallacies, it could not have been given by inspiration. And further from the same article, the specific purpose of this study is to show that all such theories, evolution, which seek to accommodate the Bible to evolutionary geology are invalid and therefore should be abandoned. Further, thus evolution is biblically unsound, theologically contradictory, and sociologically harmful. Still further, we must conclude, therefore, that if the Bible is really the Word of God, then evolution and its geological age system must be completely false. Since the Bible cannot be reinterpreted to correlate with evolution, Christians must diligently proceed to correlate the facts of science with the Bible. Now, Dr. Gish himself adds to this in Acts and Facts, where he says, I have always accepted the Bible as God's unchanged and unchangeable revelation to man. And since it describes man in his universe as a special creation of God, I've always been a creationist. Now, still further, in the book Scientific Creationism, Dr. Morris, assisted by Dr. Gish and others, writes, it should be emphasized that this order is followed not because that of putting the scientific discussion before the theological discussion. It should be emphasized that this order is followed not because the scientific data are considered more reliable than biblical doctrine. To the contrary, it is precisely because biblical revelation is absolutely authoritative and perspicuous that the scientific facts, rightly interpreted, will give the same testimony as that of Scripture. There is not the slightest possibility that the facts emphasized by being italicized, that the facts of science can contradict the Bible, and therefore there is no need to fear that a truly scientific comparison of any aspect of the two models of origins can ever yield a verdict in favor of evolution. The end of the quotations. We see here, ladies and gentlemen, clearly expressed a basic viewpoint that is the antithesis of that of science. Now, I'm not here concerned with comparing one with the other to try and decide which is right and which is wrong. That decision is for each person to make for themselves. And I'm concerned here merely to point out that these points of view, the one expressed in those quotations and the scientific point of view, are very different, and they are altogether incompatible. The scientific point of view involves a sustained attempt to build a coherent body of knowledge of the external world on the basis of the fewest possible unsupported assumptions. The only authority allowed in science is that of well-documented fact. No person or book in science has absolute authority to dictate what scientists must believe. Doubt is an integral part of the way in which science proceeds. Scientists all know that science contains errors. But science is a self-correcting system. It proceeds by a method which uncovers its own errors, and therefore tends always to produce a closer and closer approximation to truth, in quotes, whatever that may mean. So error, you see, is no crime in science. The normal way in which science grows is for a better theory to replace one that is less effective or has proved to be faulty. And facts that are proved wrong are discarded. One should also, it seems to me, distinguish very clearly between science, the body of knowledge, and the scientist, the person. If a scientific researcher or any person with a science degree expresses an opinion, it is not therefore automatically a scientific opinion. To be a scientific opinion, it must be based only on at least reasonably tested evidence that was generated within the scientific framework and by the procedures of science. If an opinion goes beyond the tested scientific evidence, it ceases to be a scientific opinion by that very fact that it goes beyond what has been established. Now, the creationists' explanation of their point of view demonstrates that it is altogether incompatible with the viewpoint of science which I have just described. On the one hand, a person cannot function within the creationist framework according to the rules of science, because no matter what his experiments may show, he may not believe anything that is inconsistent with the creationist's literal interpretation of the Bible. He is, you see, locked into an inflexible system that lays down for all time, as the quotation from Dr. Morris points out, what may be accepted and what is not. So, you see, he is not free in this situation in the way that a scientist is to follow where the evidence leads. On the other hand, the creationist cannot function within the scientific framework because, unlike scientists, he is not free to follow the evidence, but may believe only that which his inflexible, authoritarian religious system allows him to believe. Now, may I repeat that I'm not here concerned with which of these two systems is best. I'm simply trying to compare them and show the ways in which they differ. One's own psychological makeup will dictate which one prefers of these systems, and one person cannot validly decide for another which, if any, they should embrace. That's a decision that each person has to make for themselves. But what does become clear from this analysis is that there can be no such thing as a scientific case for creation as understood by members of the Creation Research Society, quote, devoid of all references to the Bible or Genesis. What science they accept and what they reject is, you see, on the basis of this explanation from scientific creationism. It's in no way related to the quality of the evidence which supports the scientific facts which are accepted. The sole criterion is, as the quoted material from Morris makes very clear, whether the science agrees with a literal interpretation of the Bible. That's the criterion which decides which science is acceptable and which isn't. So the criterion that dictates absolutely what science is acceptable to them, according to their own descriptions, that criterion lies right outside of science. Now, for this reason, it seems to me clear that it is futile to suppose that Dr. Gish and I can have a scientific debate on the validity or not of evolution. It cannot be scientific, you see, in the ordinary sense of the term, because Dr. Gish and his colleagues use a special definition of science, a religious definition. To shorten the last quotation, which I've already given from Dr. Morris, biblical revelation is absolutely authoritative, not the slightest possibility that the facts of science can contradict the Bible. Therefore, there is no need to fear that a truly scientific comparison can ever yield a verdict in favor of evolution. In other words, true science is defined as that scientific information which does not contradict a literal interpretation of the Bible. Also, by their definition, any scientific information now and in the future that supports evolution or appears to support evolution is thereby automatically not true science. I do not, and most scientists do not, accept this religious definition of what is good science and what isn't. So it seems to me thus mere pretense to say that the debate is purely on scientific grounds. The essential difference in this connection between Dr. Gish and myself is not that we are two scientists who interpret the scientific evidence differently. The essential difference is that, unlike me, Dr. Gish holds a religious belief that absolutely prohibits him from accepting as valid any scientific evidence of whatever kind that supports evolution. And I do not believe that one can really understand him without recognizing this point. Yet another factor reduces the possible meaningfulness of this debate. I accept neither of the two sides as presented. The creationists argue that there are only two valid viewpoints. Their view of literal acceptance of the Bible and an atheistic, materialistic, evolutionary interpretation on the other hand. Now, this latter point of view, an atheistic, materialistic, evolutionary view, is not the scientific view of evolution. It is a philosophical view incorporating what science knows about evolution, but going well beyond that into metaphysics. Now, I do not accept that point of view. I do not accept an atheistic, materialistic view of the universe. And I believe it highly misleading to give the impression that one is concerned with discussing the scientific view of evolution when in fact the creationists are contrasting two philosophies, a special kind of theism on the one hand and materialism on the other. Now, there are, of course, other positions than these two, and Large numbers of Christians, followers of other religions, and many scientists fall into the position of, in fact, accepting positions other than the two which are presented as the only valid ones here. Creationists categorize those who believe in evolution as atheists and materialists, and quote some statements from a few well-known biologists to prove this. This procedure involves the fallacy that anything a scientist says is science. Dr. Gish quotes, among others, G.G. Simpson, a very well-known evolutionary biologist and paleontologist of this country, in passages where he is expressing his own philosophical beliefs as proof of the basically atheistic, materialistic viewpoint of scientists about evolution. He does not, however, quote Simpson where he writes in his book, The Meaning of Evolution, "Scientists, and particularly the professional student of evolution, are often accused of a bias towards mechanism or materialism, even though believers in vitalism and finalism are not lacking among them. Such a bias as may exist is inherent in the method of science. The most successful scientific investigation has generally involved treating phenomena as if, in italics, as if they were purely materialistic, rejecting any metaphysical hypothesis as long as a physical hypothesis seems possible. The method works. The restriction is necessary because science is confined to physical means of investigation, and so it would stultify its own efforts to postulate that its subject is not physical and so not susceptible to its methods. Yet few scientists would maintain that the required restrictions of their methods necessarily delimit all truth, or that the materialistic nature of their hypotheses imposes materialism on the universe." See, this is making a clear distinction between how one has to proceed scientifically, because we cannot in the laboratory show the existence of spirit or determine that a soul exists and show what its characteristics are, and therefore it's not possible to distinguish between an hypothesis that includes such views and one that doesn't. You cannot test them, and therefore we have to proceed without that. But he points out this doesn't mean to say that because scientists have to proceed this way, that their philosophies are all that of materialism. This is the way one has to proceed as a scientist, as distinct from what one's views are as a person with a philosophy. Now, Dr. Gish also quotes Dobzhansky, a very famous evolutionist who died quite recently, as evidence that evolution is materialistic in principle. Again, where he is expressing his philosophical views. But look at the definition that Dobzhansky and colleagues give of evolution in their recent, it's 1977, textbook on evolution. This is what they give as their formal definition of evolution at the beginning of this textbook on evolution. Organic evolution is a series of partial or complete and irreversible transformations of the genetic composition of populations, based principally upon altered interactions with the environment. It consists chiefly of adaptive radiations into new environments, adjustment to environmental changes that take place in a particular habitat, and the origin of new ways for exploiting existing habitats. These adaptive changes occasionally give rise to greater complexity of developmental pattern, of physiological reactions, and of interactions between populations and their environment. As you see, there's nothing metaphysical about that definition. It does not commit one to any particular kind of philosophy. Here are a few other scientific definitions of evolution. Sewell Wright says, evolution is the statistical transformation of populations. Dodson and Dodson in the 1976 edition of their text Evolution say, evolution is the process by which related populations diverge from one another, giving rise to new species or higher groups. Moody, in the 1970 edition of his text, Introduction to Evolution, says, we may define organic evolution as the theory that plants and animals now living are the modified descendants of the somewhat different plants and animals that lived in times past. and so on, step by step, back to a beginning shrouded in mystery. Charles Darwin himself referred to evolution as descent with modification. And one might note in passing, incidentally, that the final sentence of Darwin's most famous book on evolution, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, is as follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. So, you see, one sees here then that the definitions of evolution by working biologists who are concerned with evolution contain no metaphysics and bear little resemblance to the creationist definition of evolution. The personal philosophies, on the other hand, of these same biologists range anywhere from theism all the way through to atheism at the other end of the spectrum. So, you see, there is a distinction here between what is scientifically regarded as evolution and what philosophies people hold. And scientists surely are entitled to their philosophy, or having a philosophy, just as any other person has. In my own course on evolution on this campus, I always point out that the scientific evidence for evolution is completely neutral with respect to whether or not God or any other spiritual agencies exist. On that question, one has to make up one's own mind on evidence which is not scientific. Of course, what science has found out should be considered when you are making up your philosophy, but you cannot make a complete philosophy of scientific evidence only, because science does not cover anything near the whole realm of human experience, and therefore it is not complete enough to give you a philosophy, even if it had, so to speak, completed its investigations, which it is, of course, a long way from having done. Now, looking into the validity of the scientific view of evolution involves two questions. Does it occur? And if so, by what mechanism? Now, the first is of the most relevance here, and the biologists concerned believe that its validity has been proved as well as any scientific theory or explanation can be. As Sir Karl Popper and David Hume 2 centuries before him pointed out, that no amount of logical support can in fact prove any theory to be absolutely correct. There is always the possibility and the real probability that it will be replaced by something better, and therefore you can never prove its complete validity. But that evolution is a fact of nature, evolution as understood by scientists is a fact of nature, is as certain as it can be. About the mechanism, there is a lot more doubt. Now, all of biology provides evidence supporting evolution as understood by science, but the fossil record provides direct historical evidence for testing whether the scientific kind of evolution does occur. Now, strictly speaking, if there's no evolution, that is, if there's no change, then one should find that always, wherever one looks back in the past, organisms are essentially the same. But if evolution of the scientific kind is true, that is to say that organisms change with the passage of time, then one should find, as one goes back in time, that the fossils that one finds become increasingly unfamiliar as compared to the forms that we know at the present time. And this is indeed what one finds. Going back, one reaches a point where, for example, there are no more mammals and birds. You go back further in time, you reach a point where there are no more reptiles. You go back still further in time, you reach a point where there are no more amphibia. And still further back, there are no more fish. You have only invertebrates represented in the fossil record. So the scientific view that evolution involves pattern change in living organisms as time passes is therefore clearly shown to be the case. But creationists object, saying this certainly does not satisfy them. Evidence of change within, quote, a kind is not evolution. Now what then is a kind? They define it so loosely, largely by example, that it may be a species, it may be a genus, it may be a family, it may be an order, and it may even be a class, or even slightly larger than a class, because one of the examples given is the distinction between fish on one hand and other kinds of animal on the other, and fish consist of a number of classes, so you have to go above the class level even to include all fish. Now this concept is so flexible that it's unusable. Anything can be called a kind that the occasion demands. Now, in addition to this definition by Dr. Gish, does not help. Dr. Gish explains it would be said that they had shared a common gene pool. That is to say, anything that has come from a common gene pool can be considered a kind. So do you see, if scientists could trace every known species of animal back all the way to an original species of single-celled creature, the creationists could still say, but you haven't proved evolution because they all came from that one gene pool right at the beginning. So all of nature could, by this definition, be tied into being a single kind. This kind of thing underlines my point that the creationist use of a religious definition of science makes a debate such as this really pointless. But let us persevere. Dr. Gish says that the fossil record has provided no transitional forms between different sorts of animal, and that if evolution was true, there should be many of these. Actually, there are many long family histories known: horses, elephants, camels, ammonites, literally dozens of such extended groups that are all tied together as being a clear evolutionary group are now well documented. And some of these histories may run over 50 or 60 million years, with many branches presented. But creationists say no, that's not evidence of evolution. Each of these kinds, each of these groups trace back to an original ancestral form. And therefore this definition of having belonged to a single gene pool applies, and therefore one is in fact dealing with one kind, and so change within a kind is not evolution. But is this view reasonable? What is a transitional form? The history of horses, for example, has been traced back through 50 or 60 million years to a form called Hyracotherium. Now this animal was, however, extremely different from the modern horse. It was small with relatively shorter legs and neck. It had high hindquarters and low front quarters, and it had a convexly curved back, not the straight kind of firm back that one sees in horses. The brain was more like that of a reptile, in fact, than like that of a horse. The teeth were entirely different in structure, and even between Hyracotherium and modern horses, a new tissue, a whole new tissue, cement, has come into existence in the horse line, so that later horse teeth have a different kind of structure in principle from that of the earlier ones. And on top of this, these early Hyracotherium was a forest-dwelling, browsing animal, not a plains-dwelling, grazing animal. Hyracotherium would not be regarded as any relation whatsoever to the horse of today if it was not for these transitional forms that link it to the modern horse. In fact, this is not simply a post facto statement. Hyracotherium was the first of the fossil horses that was found. And when Sir Richard Owen described it, and he looked around for what animals were most like it, he didn't consider it had any relation to the horse at all. He called it Hyracotherium because he thought it was like the hyrax, which is a small rabbit-like animal but not with long ears and without a tail, which lives in Africa, which now turns out probably to be more closely related to elephants than anything else. That's why he called it Hyracotherium. He didn't think that it had any relation at all to horses. It's only by finding the intermediate forms that we can now in fact link that creature to the horses at all. It is not a horse. It's far more like a condylog than anything else. It is the transitional forms that establish the relationship. Now, the same sort of thing is true of most of these other extended family histories. The animals that they have been traced from could not be linked to those modern forms if it were not for the transitional forms which link them. So, you see, rather than having no transitional forms, there are actually museums full of them. Each such history represents, in fact, a very large amount of evolution, both in time, in the amount of change that has occurred vertically, and also laterally in the amount of diversification that has happened within the group. But let us, however, accommodate the creationists by considering still larger transitions. Say, reptile to mammal. That, after all, is surely a pretty large-scale transition. Now, even here, the fossil record has provided good transitions. In the particular case of reptile to mammal, one of the numbers that are known, one in fact has got such a good transitional series that we've got into serious classificatory problems. We've got in the earlier portion of the sequence animals that we all agreed are reptiles, no argument. Later on in the transition, there are animals which we are all agreed are mammals, no argument. But in between are a lot that are just impossible to classify. So what we've done is simply take an arbitrary definition, draw a line across and say we will consider these from there on up mammals, and the ones below that line we will regard as reptiles. Now, one skeletal feature distinguishing reptiles from mammals, the most important differences are, of course, physiological and embryological, and you can't see those from fossils. But there are a lot of significant skeletal differences between mammals and reptiles, and one of these is the nature of the jaw hinge, the way the lower jaw attaches to the upper jaw. And in reptiles, one has this hinge consisting of an articular bone, the bone called the articular. The early jaws consist of many bones, and one of them is the articular, and it attaches or articulates with the quadrate bone in the upper jaw. In mammals, those two bones are not involved at all. It's the dentary in the lower jaw, the only bone that's left in mammals, the one that has the teeth in, and it's the squamosal bone in the upper jaw. So here you see you have just the sort of thing that anti-evolutionists commonly say proves that evolution couldn't happen. You've got two totally different kinds of structure in those two beasts. And any transition, they say, must go through a stage, if there was such a transition, which would not be functional. But in fact, the fossil record has shown very beautifully what happened. It has shown that for a while, both hinges worked, side by side, in the same animal. And then the old reptile hinge disappeared into the middle ear as two of the bones that transmit sound in the middle ear. Another of the distinctions between mammals and reptiles. In reptiles, there's only one bone in the ear transmitting sound. In the other, in mammals, you've got three. The original reptilian one and two more. And those two more are these two bones from the reptilian hinge that have disappeared and gone into the middle ear. Surely a very beautiful transition from a reptilian condition into a mammalian condition through an observed, rather unexpected, intermediate condition. Another of the things that is different between mammals and reptiles is the presence of a solid secondary bony palate, which separates the nasal cavity from the mouth cavity. There's no such separation in the parent reptiles from which the mammals arose. But again, this series of fossils shows this transition very beautifully. You actually see again something that the anti-evolutionists say can't happen. And that is, instead of there being no palate and then a complete palate with creation in between, one sees a little bony ridge start growing out from the level of the roots of the teeth on either side, and gradually, over millions of years, it extends out until eventually it meets and fuses and then expands forward and backward. And you have a complete bony palate. And those intermediate stages where there isn't complete fusion right across are represented there in the fossil record, along with these changes of the jaw hinge and so on, showing that a lot of them were going along not exactly at the same speed, but approximately parallel with each other. The same thing is true of the teeth. Reptiles have quite different teeth from mammals. And the earlier reptiles in this transition have typical reptilian teeth that are constantly being replaced, that are opposite each other, at least that you have two next to each other and one falls out, the other one's operative, and this one falls out, and meantime this one's grown back in again. And they keep on doing this right through the life of the individual in that kind of socketed toothed reptile from which the mammals came. Mammals, on the other hand, have totally different kinds of teeth. They're differentiated, they're not all alike. Their reptilian teeth are all just conical teeth. Mammalian teeth are differentiated into a different kind in front, and the canine, and then the cheek teeth consisting of premolars and molars. And they have to fit right opposite each other because you can't have the specializations of the cusps to work properly in being effective comminutors of food if you don't have them properly placed opposite each other, and they can't keep on falling out. So you have only two sets of teeth instead of a multiple of sets all through the life of the individual. In mammals you only have two. This transition you can see also right the way through that sequence. You start off with typical reptilian teeth, and the end of the sequence you've got typical mammalian teeth, and you've got all stages in between right across that transition. Now, interestingly, Dr. Gish quotes a leading expert, whom I already referred to, G.G. Simpson, as an authority for the statement that there are no known transitional forms in the record, in the fossil record. This quotation is from a 1944 book. This book was extensively revised and issued under a new title in 1953. On the basis of much new evidence, Simpson says in 1953, he points out that in fact, between the two books, more work of relevance had been done in that particular field than had been done in all the time before 1944. And in this 1953 book, Simpson says, and I quote, "Among the examples are many in which beyond the slightest doubt a species or genus has been gradually transformed into another. Such gradual transformation is also fairly well exemplified for subfamilies and occasionally for families, as the groups are commonly ranked. Splitting and gradual divergence of species is also exemplified, although not as richly as phyletic transformations, which means straightforward changes in the group without the group splitting. No doubt because paleontological samples are really adequate in spatial distribution. Splitting and gradual divergence of genera is exemplified very well and in a large variety of organisms. Complete examples of subfamilies and families are also known. Now, much more new information of this kind has accumulated since 1953 when this book was written. For example, some of the things I've been talking about in the reptile-mammal transition have come to light since that 1953 book. And one can only wonder then why Dr. Gish quoted the rather negative 1944 statement rather than the very positive 1953 statement, since references in his book show that in fact he used both books. Now, Simpson goes on, after having made this clear-cut statement about transitions in the record, to make the very reasonable point that since the record has now provided examples from tiny transitions through to major transitions, that the gaps that still remain, presumably, were filled by similar transitions. That is to say, that having established a few transitions, major transitions, as fact, that proves the principle as valid. I guess my time is getting a bit short, so I'd just like to make two more points very briefly. Creationists often say no one has ever observed the origin of a new species. Now, this is not so. In 1927, for example, Karpchenko crossed cabbage and radish, producing a new kind of plant. It was sort of a useless plant because it didn't have the head of the cabbage and it didn't have the root of the radish. But it was, in fact, an extraordinarily interesting plant because it was freely fertile itself, but could not breed with either of its parents, and therefore was a genetically isolated new kind of plant, quite separate from its parent forms. And at around this time, from 1925 to about 1935, a number of such experiments produced this kind of new plant. And what's more, chromosome studies, because of course genetically such a plant is widely different from either of its parents because it contains the complete genetic makeup of both of the parents. But studies on the chromosomes and so on of flowering plants has shown that this process, which has been done experimentally in this way, apparently was very common in flowering plants, because there are many plants with a chromosome makeup that indicates that this type of thing has been happening, that there were new plants derived from hybridization between other plants. Now, in his book, Dr. Gish states that mutations are crucial to the scientific view of evolution. Yet, observed mutations, he says, always prove to be harmful. That's a quote. And he goes on to say that probably not a single observed mutation can definitely be said to have increased the viability of the organisms involved. Now, this statement is contradicted by an extensive scientific literature on the topic. Most people are probably perfectly well aware of this because I'm sure most of you have heard of the cases where some disease organism that was well controlled by some particular antibiotic develops by mutation forms which are resistant to the antibiotic, and this produces problems, particularly in hospitals, where these organisms become established in the hospitals because of the presence of the antibiotics there all the time. These resistant forms become established in the hospitals, and this produces a particular bad medical problem. Now, to investigate that kind of thing, a Nobel laureate, Joshua Lederberg, who used to be a professor of genetics on this campus, did an experiment in which he showed that a particular bacterium that he was studying, in the presence of as little as 0.2 micrograms per milliliter of streptomycin, were unable to survive. But a mutation occurred in that strain after quite a long time. A mutation occurred in it which allowed the mutated form to survive quite happily in 125,000 micrograms per milliliter of streptomycin. In other words, the capacity for that organism to survive in that particular situation where there is streptomycin present had been enormously increased. Much experimental evidence now exists demonstrating improved viability caused by mutation in a wide range of organisms. Drosophila, the vinegar fly, commonly known as a fruit fly, has been studied enormously in this respect. There are a large number of mutations that have been observed, and it has been calculated by the people working most extensively on it that about 10% of mutations are not harmful, and of those 10%, a significant amount are in fact beneficial, and many studies have been shown to demonstrate this. I mean, detailed kinds of studies, such as in the case of one particular, just to name one out of many, mutation known as Eversi, that compared to the stock which produced that mutation, the controls, that if tested at a temperature of 16 degrees Celsius, the new mutated form was 2% less viable than the original. And if tested at 29 degrees centigrade, it was 2% less viable than the original stock. But at 25 degrees, it was 4% more viable than the original stock. So this kind of detailed documentation of the fact that mutations do improve, can improve viability, is very well established, and there are many other examples. Probably many people have heard of the numerous examples, more than 100 cases, of industrial melanism in moths, where light-colored moths have produced dark populations in areas that have been industrially polluted. Now, this has been genetically well established that this is a mutation at the site that causes that produces the normal coloration of the light moths. But where the environment was becoming very dark, the light moths are so conspicuous they get eaten, and they become very unsuccessful, even though they're very successful in unpolluted areas where they're very camouflaged when they sit on the mottled tree trunks and are preyed on by birds. If they're conspicuous, they get seen by the birds and eaten immediately. If they're inconspicuous, they can survive and breed and hand on those successful characteristics. But where the environment starts becoming affected by pollution, as it commonly was around the middle of last century, where these mutations that produce the dark individuals show up, they enable the moths to survive more easily, because the dark forms against the polluted tree trunks and so on are not easily seen by birds. So here you find a mutation which is in those circumstances producing a very much more viable organism, because in fact in some cases the mutations didn't occur quickly enough, and in those cases the populations disappeared from those areas. They couldn't, as light moths, survive in those areas. But if the mutation producing the dark form showed up, they were able to survive. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I've been trying to show here is to show what the assumptions are, using from the point of view of the creationists their own writings, and not trying to give my definition of what they believe, and to contrast that with what scientists believe about evolution, and to show that there is a great deal of detailed evidence. And of course there are large areas of evidence that I've not gone into. There simply isn't time for that, to demonstrate that what scientists mean by evolution is something that is very well documented, and in fact so much so that almost any field, well, in fact any field of biology, produces large amounts of evidence in favor of this fact that you've got an enormous amount of patternedness in nature. You've got the kinds of evidence such as that I've just lightly touched on here, of studies of populations, and there are many besides those of the moths, which show the action of natural selection. The interaction, all natural selection is, it's nothing mysterious, is the natural interaction of organisms with their environment, the consequence of which is that certain kinds of individual survive more easily than others, and by so doing and reproducing, bias the characteristics of the next generation in the direction which proved to be successful in the generation before. And so we've not only got then from the fossil record evidence of minor transitions, very small scale changes, which could be brought about quite easily by the sort of natural selection operation that we see in natural populations that have been studied over long periods of time. But we've also got in the fossil record this clear indication that this process leads to very small transitions, larger transitions, right through to major transitions, where in fact you have something like a clear-cut reptile being converted over a period of around 100 million years into a clear-cut mammal. So it seems to me that if one divorces the scientific point of view, and after all, the statement was that we would be discussing the scientific evidence, discussing it from a scientific point of view. If one divorces the philosophical, if one gets away from this common notion that what evolution means is an atheistic interpretation of the universe, it doesn't mean that. That is the philosophy of materialism. And if one gets away from that, one realizes that there is a multitude of evidence for evolution. And in fact, the situation is such that biology would consist of a series of isolated studies having very little relation to each other at all if you take evolution as the scientist understands it out of biology. It is the scientific theory of evolution which ties biology into a single recognizable whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Robinson. According to our schedule, we will now take a 5-minute break to stretch a little and give you the chance to write questions in response. 5 minutes, no more.